I'm Brady Harron, and this is the Numberphile podcast. Now, the idea of mathematics being done by artificial intelligence has just taken another step forward with a breakthrough paper in the journal Nature. Researchers at Google's DeepMind project have collaborated with a handful of mathematicians using algorithmic wizardry to find previously unknown patterns and possibilities. The mathematicians then leapt on these discoveries, making them the basis for new papers. Today I'm talking to Alex Davies from DeepMind. Just so you know, you'll hear him reference some of his mathematical collaborators throughout the interview, usually by their first names. I've put more details about them in the podcast description. Later, I'll also be talking with Oxford professor Marcus de Sautoy, who also has lots of interesting things to say about this topic. But first, here's Alex from Google. When I think of this DeepMind project, I think of some huge computer the size of a gymnasium with racks of flashing lights and things like that. But that's not what DeepMind is it? What is DeepMind? How do you describe DeepMind to someone at the pub?
So, yeah, it's a great question. So DeepMind is a research organization. So it's less like a big computer that sits somewhere in a warehouse. But it's a research institute that just has a lot of researchers who are all focused on a similar kind of thing, which is trying to develop general intelligence and use it to advance science and benefit humanity and all this kind of stuff.
So DeepMind is more like a group of people with an ethos rather than a machine or any kind of piece of technology.
Yeah, very much. So yeah, DeepMind is a big group of people who are all trying to achieve the same goal, and in doing this, we build AI systems to, say, play Go or play StarCraft or try and help mathematicians, but all, in service of this one goal. So
when we say famously DeepMind beat the world's best Go player, we are saying it was a group of people that did it, not a computer.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's two ways to look at it, right? There's the AlphaGo team. So there's the team of people that built this system that learned how to play Go and then beat the human. But then it's also kind of fair to say there is a computer system called AlphaGo that beat the world champion at Go.
They couldn't have done it without a computer.
They certainly couldn't have done it without a computer, and the computer certainly couldn't have done it without them.
That gives us a little bit of a better idea as to what DeepMind is. Who are you in the DeepMind jigsaw puzzle? Like, what do you do there?
So I work in the sciences team in DeepMind. So that's the part which takes the machine learning research at DeepMind and tries to apply it to accelerate work in the sciences. So the other big release from the science team this year was AlphaFold. But I focus on maths and seeing whether or not we can accelerate mathematical work using machine learning.
How did you get into that, Alex? Are you a math guy yourself, or are you like an AI tech guy who just sort of got seconded to the math part? How did you end up with this specialization?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I don't have a math background. I'm not a math guy particularly. It's one of the exciting things for me in this project was working with some of these excellent math guys that we did. So Geordie and Mark and Andrash. And so I have more of a machine learning, computer science, AI background. And a number of years ago, Demis and Pushmeet kind of came up with the suggestion that, now would be a really good time to try and help mathematicians. I just thought that sounded like a fantastic thing to be doing. And so just jumped right in.
Now, there's this new paper in Nature, which you guys are really excited about, and a bunch of other papers associated with it. And I saw it was in the Times newspaper on page 3. So you're making headlines with what you've done at the moment. What have you done at the moment? How would you describe the news that's just come out in recent days?
I didn't even know it was on page 3, so thanks for the heads up. I'd describe this work as helping mathematicians see patterns in the things that they study that they didn't notice were there before, that we can do because machine learning is good at spotting patterns in really large amounts of data that we can generate about some of these objects that these guys study.
Until now, the discussions I've had with many mathematicians is they've always thought kind of the creative and clever part of mathematics was exclusively the domain of humans, and computers could be used to help them maybe with some brute force calculations, things that they may take weeks with paper and pencil, and they can quickly do with a computer to take their next creative step. Is that changing? Are you trying to change that?
I think it's not changing that humans are really doing the creative part, because I think that they still were doing that in this work, but they're just being supported in a slightly different, I think, additional way. So if I can try and explain what I mean there, is like what you said is exactly right. Up until now, mathematicians have been super comfortable with using computers to generate lots of examples that would take a long time for them to do by hand, that they can then look at and see patterns and then kind of work with. And what we're doing here is generating all the data like they would before, but a lot of data which is annoying or difficult for mathematicians to kind of visualize. So you can't really take this data and plot it and look at it so that they can then, do the creative part of using their intuition to collapse these patterns to something interesting for them. And so what we're instead getting the computer to do, which is what machine learning is really good at, is look in these high dimensional spaces and say, hey, that looks like there's kind of a pattern here. And then that's where the creativity of the mathematician starts to kick off, where Mark or Geordie's like, oh, that's really surprising that there's something going on here. Maybe I should look over here. And then when they know where to look, they fire away.
Are you saying until now, even that pattern recognition step has been kind of a human slog?
Yeah, exactly. I think that would be honestly a better question for the mathematicians about how they view the different parts of what they're doing. But exactly, they have to look through all these things and they might occasionally have these insights of, oh, there's a pattern here. This might be an interesting direction for me to go in. But for a lot of these things, it seems like, some of the, like in knot theory, I think is a good example. This pattern has been there for 100 years and people have been generating data and looking at it, but they just didn't notice it before. And always kind of giving them is a little hint to say like, hey, this is over here and this seems interesting. Like maybe you should check this out. And when Mark sees something and gets really excited and is interested in it, that's when we know that the machine is delivering something useful for a mathematician.
How do you actually do this? It feels to me like you've done sort of a few little pilot projects here where you've sat down with working mathematicians and said, this is what we've got. What have you got?
That's exactly right. We have kind of gone through this process of sitting down together and trying to understand what tools we have in machine learning that might be helpful for maths, and conversely, what problems mathematicians actually want solved, and getting a better understanding of what mathematicians do, which was a bit of a journey for me. I think I had an opinion of what mathematics was before going into it, which was informed by like doing it at high school and doing it at uni as an undergrad. And what actual mathematicians do is really different. And I think the best metaphor I've come up with so far is that doing mathematics at school is kind of like learning how to play scales when you're playing music. It's like not creative and it's kind of repetitive and a little bit boring. But then you see a jazz pianist and they're really good. And what they're doing mostly is not the technical part. They're doing this creative part. When
you first sat down with the mathematicians on this project, what did they want from you? What were they saying? Like, I guess it was a bit of what have you got? What have I got? What did you feel like they wanted from you?
When we started off, we didn't really have a lot of common ground to understand and to get things kind of moving. And so we talked a little bit about what kind of different problems there were. And initially we were, a lot of the work that people outside of DeepMind were familiar with was, say, AlphaGo and this kind of like idea of something playing a game. And so this was one mental model to try and think about maths. But it kind of turned out, I think in the end, that playing an adversarial game is not a good model for mathematics. It's not actually, even though that's where we've had success in the past, that's not what mathematics is like. And so we kind of did some work together, kind of learned how to speak each other's languages a bit. And then I think a turning point was when Demis put forward this kind of motivating example of Ramanujan as a mathematician who is really famous, but in particular was really famous for being able to see patterns that other people couldn't see. And this was the kind of, light bulb moment where we're like, okay, well, this is actually something that we know machine learning can do, see patterns that people can't see. And so I went back to Mark and was like, where would it be interesting if we could find a pattern or relationship in the things that you study? And he said, okay, well, obviously it would be very cool if there was a relationship between the hyperbolic geometry of knots and the algebraic structure. There almost certainly isn't. So it's probably not going to work, but, whatever. We'll try it out. If there's something there, it'd be amazing, but, don't get your hopes up.
And what? And you found something?
Yeah, and we found something. And we went to him and we're like, it looks like you can. He's like, I'm pretty sure that's wrong. I don't know that can you please check the numbers again? And we're like, nah, it really seems like there is something here. And that was the first point when we saw him get really excited by something that challenged what his intuition would originally tell him and took him down a different path that than he otherwise would have looked at.
So, I mean, I understand the level of mathematics that these people are working at is probably beyond something we can discuss on a podcast, especially as neither you nor I are experts in mathematics.
Correct.
But can you give me some slightly better idea as to what was being found? Would it be like you would say, oh, did you know there are 8 ways of classifying this knot? And over in algebraic geometry, there's also 8 ways of doing X, Y, and Z. Maybe there's a link between these two disciplines? Is it kind of that kind of thing? Or
yeah, that's pretty close. I'll give you the best explanation that I have, again, to my understanding of this field. So there's essentially these two camps of how you measure a knot. And so on the geometry side, there's a kind of way that you can measure the volume of a knot or the length of different parts of it. That tells you something important about the knot. And then on the algebraic side, they're different kind of measurements of what the knot looks like, but it's more about how does it twist around? How many times does it kind of twist over itself in a certain way? And so those are both to a mathematician, they're pretty obvious. If you started a knot, you can go down one direction and start measuring, or you can go in the other direction and look at how it twists. But it wasn't clear to them how you can directly connect those two things. Like, how does it twisting say something about how much, is the measurements of certain things are?
So this paper that's come out in Nature, as I understand it, that's more kind of an overview of this form of collaboration and the success you've been having, trying to get it out there in the community that, hey, mathematicians, you can work with this kind of technology and there can be breakthroughs. But at the same time as this paper, you've also published, or the mathematicians have also published, the results of these collaborations. There are actual real mathematical papers that have come out of this?
Yeah, that's right. And I think all of them were a really important part of this work, because what we wanted to show to the mathematical community through the Nature paper is that you can use machine learning to actually get results that are significant from a mathematician's perspective. So we've put these mathematical papers out on the archive and we'll submit them to mathematical journals, because we believe, and others have said, that these results are significant mathematical results regardless of whether they were found with machine learning or not. And that's kind of what we were aiming to do. And then with the Nature paper, we're talking about this process to say, like, hey, this was some of the first places that we looked with machine learning, and we got these kind of cool results. Other people should be able to do this. Like, there's no reason that someone else can't look at the Nature paper and be like, oh, okay, that's pretty simple. This is my area of maths. Let's go and do it.
Again, this is a question for mathematicians, and I'm sure I will ask mathematicians this at some point, but it's worth asking you too. Where is the genius in mathematics and mathematical proof? Is it finding those patterns and recognizing those patterns, which in this case the AI did, or is it then writing up a proof and joining the dots and knitting it all together? I mean, is the AI doing the really hard part? Is the proof that comes afterwards still the really hard part? Where is the hard part?
That's a great question. I don't really know the full answer to this question. I actually think, it's in all parts of the process. And Geordie did write an article where I think he put a good spin on this, where he said that he likes to think of it as intelligence has different dimensions. He likes to think of artificial intelligence as a new dimension on the other aspects of the mathematical dimensions of intelligence that kind of he has and brings to the table.
The paper you're writing and the message you're trying to get out at the moment, is it just, hey, mathematicians, you should work with AI? Or is it, hey, mathematicians, you should work with DeepMind? Like, are you saying, has DeepMind got some special sauce that the other AI hasn't got yet? Or are you kind of just cheerleading in general?
Really cheerleading in general. I think our message is definitely mathematicians should try and work with AI. And also, you don't need us. You don't need DeepMind. I think we're in a good position to try and do this first and demonstrate it's possible, because honestly, it took a long time to figure out what the right way to work with mathematicians was, and it requires a bit of long-term dedication and a building of trust that we did over a period of time. But I think now that we've figured this part out, hopefully it is not too hard to replicate.
Do you expect more resistance in the future? And have you encountered much resistance in the past? Like, is that, obviously a new technology, there could be intimidating to think, other computers coming and doing my job. What have you encountered in the past, and how have you dealt with that?
Yeah, good question. So I think when we first started talking to mathematicians originally, there was a lot of different responses to when we said, like, hey, what do you think? Will machine learning be helpful in maths in some way? I think there was a lot of resistance for some people who said, machine learning's kind of cool, it's interesting, it's done some fun stuff in recognizing images of dogs and cats, but I can't see any way that it would help me in the work that I do in mathematics. And for some people, it's probably still true. I think there's probably some mathematicians for whom this is not actually really that relevant, but I think there are a lot for whom it is. And we have noticed that over time, I think people have become more open-minded to the idea of machine learning in maths, especially as they've had a chance to talk to some of the people that we've worked with, and they've had some insight that, yeah, actually it was working for these other people, so why wouldn't it work for me?
Just a quick interlude to thank G Research for sponsoring this episode. G Research is a Europe-based leading quantitative finance research firm. They hire some of the world's smartest people to tackle some of the biggest questions in finance. They're using machine learning, big data, and some of the world's most advanced technology to predict market movements. Maybe someone listening to this episode could be the next person to join their team. G Research promises a great working environment, and they're super keen to nurture future talent. To learn more about them, go to gresearch.co.uk/numberphile. I'll link to them in the show notes too. G Research, create today, predict tomorrow. Okay, before we talk more to Alex, I thought I'd bring in Marcus de Sautoy. He's a mathematics professor at Oxford University. You may even recognise him from some recent Numberphile videos. But Marcus is also well known for his book, The Creativity Code, going deep into how AI can be used in the world of, creativity, including his own field of mathematics. I've seen him give some great talks about this topic, and ruffle a few mathematicians' feathers in the audience, just quietly. So, here's Marcus. Is this a bit of an I told you so moment for you?
It is to a certain extent, because I certainly knew this should be on the horizon, that at some point AI would help us to start to see things that without this tool we wouldn't be able to see. But there's a really interesting quality to the involvement of AI in doing mathematics. Because when you're doing scientific experiments, then, it is about finding some sort of correlation between one set and another. But mathematics has a slightly different quality about it, and it's about proof. So I think everyone's first thought was, well, how is AI going to be used in actually doing mathematical proofs? Now, computers have been used in mathematical proofs over the last few decades. The most famous one is the use of a computer in the four-color map problem, that it was involved in checking a huge number of examples, but a finite number that a human would have taken ages to get through. And that seems like an obvious thing for a computer to do. But that wasn't terribly creative. It wasn't coming up with a kind of new pathway. It was just checking examples. And that, up to a few years ago, is really the role that a computer was playing. It was just doing donkey work. But the real challenge was, well, could a computer actually do something more interesting than just a human telling it what to do? Could it find new things to do? And so, I suppose, a mathematician's bread and butter is coming up with proofs. And that I don't think we have seen yet. What we're seeing here is something of a slightly different nature and a slightly more kind of scientific pursuit, which is, okay, let's look at the data and see if we can find new connections that we haven't seen before. And so this is a great use of AI in coming up with new conjectures rather than new proofs. And that's certainly an important part of doing mathematics. But I think it's important to kind of qualify. This isn't an AI coming up with a new proof of the Riemann hypothesis, for example. This is an AI coming up with the idea of a new conjecture like the Riemann hypothesis rather than a proof.
So this is sort of finding the fertile ground in which to plant the gardens rather than actually doing all the, the gardening.
Yeah, and actually, you know what? If you look back at the history of mathematics, this is a really important way that people came up with new insights. I mean, I think if you look at Carl Friedrich Gauss, when he came up with his conjecture about the prime number theorem, about the way that primes thin out as we climb higher and higher through the universe of numbers. The primes look very random, but he was able to take the data as, he took tables of primes and started to see a pattern which was connected to the logarithm function. And that gave him a conjecture. And it wasn't proved until kind of 100 years later that connection was really a true connection. So the thing about data is that often you need a huge amount of data to really start to sniff out what's going on inside there. So this is perfect territory for machine learning and artificial intelligence, because there's a limit to how much our brains can take in and how much we can kind of see what's going on. And this is where collaborating with an AI that can say, yeah, okay, I'm happy to sweep through this data and try out various connections between two sets of data and try and sniff out if I can see some functional relationship between those. And I can, vary the functions around and start to see, oh my gosh, it's a very small bit of this data which is driving the other data set. So I compare it a little bit to, I think, that moment that Galileo got a telescope and suddenly was able to see deep into the solar system, into our universe, and see things we hadn't seen before. We have huge amounts of data, and kind of our own human embodiment is finding it difficult to navigate and see patterns there. And that's where this new telescope, this data telescope, can help us to sniff out those patterns and make suggestions. But it's interesting that still we're handing, the AI is then handing over to us to try and prove why there is a connection there. So it's a very interesting new sort of collaboration there. And I think the real challenge is going forward, when will we see actually AI coming up with a really creative way to prove some of these conjectures rather than throwing up this connection? And I think, the AI is really about chewing on data and kind of getting a feel for what's going on. It isn't so good necessarily at coming up with this kind of 100% proofs.
Is it possible the AI is just going to start throwing up conjectures faster than mathematicians can prove them?
I think that's quite a distinct possibility, that we'll start to see AI chewing on all of these numbers that we can generate and proposing more and more conjectures. But I think that's fine, because that's really where mathematics begins, is suddenly seeing that far distant mountain and saying, wow, I think there's a path to get there. And then because it's very difficult to head out into the unknown if you can't see a destination in the distance to head towards. And that's kind of what the AI is offering. I think there is something out there for you to go and find.
Of all the different things mathematicians do when they work towards a proof, it seems like finding the patterns, coming up with the conjectures is one of the steps. It's quite an important step. And this feels like the step that maybe computers are going to start muscling out the humans. Are you sad for that? It seems like the fields on which the mathematicians can play is ever shrinking, and they're being pushed further and further down the production line.
I think that the benefits far outweigh the disappointment that I might feel for, I wish it was one of our side that came up with this connection, because one of the most exciting moments is the suggestion of a new connection, because that gets us all fired up to begin our journeys, getting on all our hiking gear to go out and try and climb that mountain. And I think many people think that the ability to find a conjecture perhaps is more valuable than coming up with the final proof of that conjecture. And it often is, in some ways, the hardest thing, because there's nothing there until you see a hint of something going on. So I think that comparison with a telescope is really a strong one. Why would we limit ourselves to doing astronomy with our naked eye just because we want to see it? We really want to see it ourselves. No, I'm quite happy to stick a few bits of glass in front of my eye and see further. So I think we just need to consider it a bit like that. Yeah, we got the opportunity to stick a telescope in front of our mathematical eyes and see some things that we couldn't see before.
Now, here's Andrew Davies again. The obvious next question for someone who's a bit mischievous like me is going to be, all right, the AI can now recognize the patterns and can find you the targets of the juicy mathematics. How long until the AI can also now do the proof, write the paper, make the mathematician human, completely redundant.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a good thing to think about in general, like, where can these kind of things go? I'll kind of refer back to this journey of me understanding what it is mathematicians do. And I genuinely think the most helpful thing for this, aside from talking to the people who we work with, was this paper called On Proof and Progress in Mathematics by Thurston, who's this super famous topologist geometer. And I'll kind of butcher whatever the actual quote is, but I'm sure you can look it up. But he roughly said that when he started doing maths, he kind of went into this field and just smashed it. He just was like doing all these proofs, and reflecting back on this time, he said, when I started in this field, I thought what people wanted was me to give them all these sweet proofs and answers that they can then go and build on. But people weren't very psyched. And what they were really looking for was human understanding of these proofs. And so he kind of took a step back, and again, I don't know if I'm going to tell this story very accurately, but later on in his career, he kind of set forward these conjectures more like what we're doing at the moment in order to guide the field of human mathematics forwards. And if I can kind of tie that back to what I was saying before, I think mathematics, the more that I've worked with mathematicians, it seems like mathematics isn't a game you play to win. It's a game you play to have fun.
Is there any danger that an AI is also going to just pick the low-hanging fruit? Like, take the patterns, like, oh, yeah, I'll pick all those patterns like apples because they're the nice, easy ones, and miss something completely out of left field?
Yeah, I think that there's certain types of patterns that the machine will be good at spotting. And then there's other types of patterns that will definitely be very bad at spotting. So I think that if you look at all of the possible relationships that go through maths, I think we've showed that we can find some, but in machine learning, we definitely know we're good at kind of learning some kind of functions and finding some kind of patterns, and we're quite bad at finding others. And so I think if you look at probably certain areas of maths, the kind of patterns that are very delicate, I guess, and rather than smooth, is probably the best description I'll give you, are ones that machine learning tends not to be able to find. And, we kind of maybe haven't gone too much in depth about, mathematicians have done this already. They look at examples in the data, they see the patterns and do stuff. There are also other ways that mathematicians find patterns that don't involve looking at the data. And so those kind of ones really aren't addressed by this technique and maybe are less amenable to machine learning generally.
I think we're really seeing a little bit of a transformation moment in the mathematical community where people are beginning to realize that it's silly just to rely on just human tools if we've got other tools that can help us to make these discoveries. I think the really important point is that we want to feel like we understand why something is the way it is. And in the past, actually, the role of a computer could often obscure that understanding of why the thing is like it is. If it's just churning through examples, that it was almost like listening to a piece of music on a CD player, and then you turn the volume down, and the actual CD player is listening to the music, but you're not, and then you turn it up at the end and you hear the final chord. It's very unsatisfying. So I think that we will be okay with this if we feel like it's helping us to have that understanding, rather than just taking over and saying, yeah, it's true, but I'm not really going to tell you why it's true because I understand it's really complex, though. You're just going to have to believe me on this. That I think is the fear, that will the complexity of these solutions, if it starts to be really good at theorem proving, is it just going to come up with such complex theorems and proofs that we don't really get what's going on? And I think that's the fear.
Earlier you were talking about how proofs are still the domain of mathematicians. That's the thing the computer can't do yet. But you think the computers will get there eventually?
Yes. When I wrote the creativity code, one of the things I was interested in is how good it could be as a mathematician, because I believe that coming up with proofs is a very creative act. And there were some early examples of trying to use machine learning to come up with proofs. What they did was what I do as a mathematician is to read lots of proofs in the past, get an intuition, a feel for the direction to go in logically when I'm making new moves. And it was trying to pick up a feel for, what logical move would make sense next from what I've learned. But it was proving some theorems, but they were really uninteresting theorems. So what it hadn't got was the quality of the sort of aesthetic nature of what we regard as exciting insights versus just rather boring logical connections, which may have the same complexity value, but just not the same aha moment inside it. But there is
significance.
Yeah, exactly. Or the significance of it. But you see, it can learn significance because it starts to see, well, what are the significant results that are in the literature already? I mean, this is the point about machine learning. It takes the data. It's okay. It seems humans seem to think these are very valuable sorts of discoveries. So I will try and match my discovery to fit the parameters that I'm picking up in the journals already. So I don't think it's something that machine learning couldn't learn, the things that we love proving. But I think there's one thing that's going for AI and machine learning when it's doing mathematics, because mathematics in some sense is a very young activity. We've really only been doing it for a couple of thousand years. And actually the amount of time that human species has spent actually doing mathematics over that time is also quite small. So I think, just in the same way as often you get a very young person making a big breakthrough, they sort of get, as long as they immerse themselves in the world of mathematics, they can get quite a maturity beyond their kind of years, but actually their mathematical years, they are mature. So how did I become a mathematician? I read a lot of theorems and learned the techniques, and then I started making my own moves. I don't see that the domain that AI will have to sort of journey over is that rich and complex and so developed that it couldn't get the same intuition as me. In contrast, say, to a visual domain, we've been experiencing visuals and making visuals for thousands and thousands of years as a species. And so that our visual sense is highly developed in our brain. And I think that is very hard to replicate in AI, whilst I think our mathematical intuitions are probably of a much less complex nature, that an AI might get to that stage where it's got the maturity that is starting to make interesting mathematical breakthroughs.
Could computers put mathematicians out of business?
It's possible, but I don't think that that's what I'm seeing in any domain, really. That what I find is that, I think we have a terribly linear way of looking at that kind of challenge, which is, we talk about the singularity, the moment that AI is more intelligent than humans. And I think intelligence is so much more multidimensional that, I think there'll be directions in which AI will be much better than humans. But the evidence is that there are some things that humans seem to be better at judging rather than the AI. And so that's why I think, I'm always talking about the power of collaboration in this, that, better to work together, and we'll get so much further than trying to expect one to do it all on their own.
From a DeepMind perspective, what happens now? Like, do you create a math department and have all the world's best mathematicians come to you and beg for help? Or do you say, okay, there's a proof of concept, we're going to walk away now and leave you guys to it? Like, what happens now? You've scored a couple of early goals. Do you go for more?
Yeah, I mean, I think we kind of see what happens to start with. I guess we kind of put this paper out there. We put the maths papers out there. We're kind of releasing code so that people can see what we did and see if they like it. And part of it, I guess, is to see what the response from the mathematical community really is in the next, weeks or months. They might say, how have we not noticed this? Let's all get on board and start doing it. Or there might be more resistance, and they're like, okay, you had a few good examples, but we need to see more evidence before we're going to be really convinced this is a great thing to be doing. I think we have enough evidence that we're convinced it's really something that's valuable and worth doing. So it's definitely something that I'm going to be continuing to follow in some way, but we're going to try and listen and see what the community has to say and respond to that.
Do you practice what you preach here? Have you started collaborating with AI people in your spheres of research?
I thought for some time about how to use this tool. I could see it was very powerful. But what I found is that you need to be in a research area which has a lot of data that you can kind of let the AI loose on. And my area of research just didn't seem to have that kind of way of doing the subject, that actually maybe my area is more protected from AI creeping in, because I'm dealing very much with the infinite, so it's very hard for it to navigate what's going on in an infinite set. That's the sort of place where human intuition may be much better, because we seem to have got very good tools for navigating infinity. Also, my emphasis is more on mathematical proof, so I felt that the sort of way I do mathematics is generating proofs as a way of exploring what's going on, and that intuition, I couldn't see how to use machine learning to help me make progress. But I think these are two wonderfully new examples which might make me reassess how to use this as a tool in doing what I do, which I think is really exciting. So to see proof of concept, this can be done. So you have to find kind of two data sets you might think have something to do with each other, and then let the AI loose to say, I think there is an interesting connection here. Why don't you try this as a conjecture?
To my mind, I can easily see a future where almost any math team or collaboration of consequence has like a dedicated AI person.
Yeah, I mean, me too. Honestly, I think that it seems like it's the tool that we have now. You wouldn't probably have many mathematicians who would say, well, I wouldn't ever use a computer for anything. They use it where it's helpful as a tool. And I think this is just a new tool where often you do need someone who's a bit of a specialist in order to get stuff up and running. So it seems to make a lot of sense to me that mathematicians would just find, someone, postdoc in machine learning who's pretty good, get them on board, and then they can all work together to find something exciting and new.
Well, that's all for today's episode. Thanks to both Alex Davies and Marcus de Sautoy for joining us. There will be lots of links and important information in the notes for this episode, so do check them out. Thanks again to G Research for sponsoring this episode, and the Mathematical Sciences Research Institute for its ongoing support. I'm Brady Harron, and you've been listening to the Numberphile podcast. We'll be back soon with some more very special guests.